All right. So hi, this is Dan Strecce. I'm your Director of Outreach and Engagement for the Rspo. What I was trying to say while I was muted was good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all those who have joined our first RT series event hosted by the Rspo or the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I will be acting as your MC today. And I'm really excited for us to kick off this series. I think we first have to acknowledge the reality of so many people across this planet that have been impacted by this pandemic, with the loss of loved ones, the loss of jobs, and perhaps a loss of what life was like before all this started. For us here at the Rspo, one of the events that we always looked forward to was our annual RT Roundtable conference. We would normally have been meeting in some location in Asia in November. This year instead, we hosted our RT virtually, or our General Assembly virtually. And now, in place of the annual conference, we're going to be launching this RT series. So what exactly is the RT series? Well, what we're hoping to do is to bring you timely information, panels, and thought leadership on the biggest issues facing the sustainable palm oil industry. We're going to do this through these types of webinars, fireside chats, and other digital communications as we grow this series, and then work towards, once again, meeting in person. Perhaps it will be a physical or a hybrid event for RT21 somewhere in Asia, perhaps somewhere warmer, not like I am right now in New York. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to bring the issues that we should be talking about, not waiting till November, but let's talk about them on a regular cadence, on a monthly basis. And while we can't recreate that in-person experience that we would normally get with an RT, we still felt that we could bring some of the amazing content that you expect to see at an RT. And tonight, I think we're going to do that. Tonight, we're going to bring in a global audience, hence the time zone, very early for me here in the Americas, late for you in Asia, and in the sweet spot for Europe. But we're going to bring in that global audience and see if we can't try to bring this content to our membership, which now spans more than 100 countries. In regards to tackling difficult issues and events, we'll be discussing human rights and our grievance systems. And tonight you're going to hear from civil society, NGOs, corporate experts, and representatives of the RSPO like myself. But before we start, I think we have to go through a few housekeeping notes. So if we could start the slides for housekeeping, please. I think the first thing to say, which isn't on this list, is if a pet, loved one, spouse, child happens to walk on screen, it's 2021, we're almost a year into this, and you're probably used to those types of issues. And obviously, if there's any sort of bandwidth issue or technical issue, please bear with us as we all call in remotely from around the globe. Please enter your name, organization into the Zoom using the rename function, just so that we know who's asking questions, what those questions are. All attendees will be muted to enable speakers and panelists to present without interruption. We will carry out this program in English, but we do have simultaneous interpretation. So you can click on the little globe feature and you can pick your selected language. We also invite questions and comments. There's a Q&A box that you should see. Enter your questions in there. And we will do our best to feed them to the moderators today, myself and Alex Expertin from Cargill. We might not be able to get to every question, but we will try our best. We will not take any specific questions on investigations or complaints that are before the RSPO. We also recommend that you close any unnecessary internet browsers, because you never know if you're going to have bandwidth issues. And finally, I think the most important is to enjoy the content. Second housekeeping is, if you can go to the next slide, the RSPO it refers to its antitrust guidelines for the conduct of all of our meetings and conference calls. You can find that on our website here at this link. There should be no specific discussion on selling or buying of materials, pricing, or any joint venture, future or collusive actions, such as excluding or choosing a supplier or geographies. All commentary is limited to current or historical activity. Any discussion or decision you reach from this meeting's material or discussed in the meeting as an individual decision based on your own investigation and judgment. Pretty standard for us when we meet. With that, I sincerely hope you will enjoy this virtual gathering and gain valuable insights from our speakers today. We're going to start by kicking off on our first panel, which is going to be continuing joint efforts to address labor issues. Our moderator for the first panel will be Alexandra Experton of Cargill. She will be joined by Arti Kapoor of Embode, Matt Friedman of the Mekong Club, Dr. Serena Ishmael from IOI Corporation, and Gerald Joseph of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. Alex, the floor is yours.
Dan, thanks for the introduction, and to the panelists and audience for joining this evening and today. There's growing demand for palm oil, and this means a growing need for a large number of workers in plantations. Many palm oil plantation workers, unfortunately, face a range of social challenges, from an unethical recruitment practices to unsafe working conditions, retention of identification. These workers also often have no access to legal or political recourse. Social issues related to palm oil operations are also among the most difficult to identify and audit. That said, there has been unprecedented collaboration and proactive initiative across the sector, particularly over the past 5 to 6 years. And part of this has been rooted in the RSPO's Human Rights Working Group, which was established in 2014, with the purpose of guiding members in implementing human rights related criteria, identifying areas for improvement that can inform future iterations of the standard, as well as developing mechanisms to identify, prevent, and mitigate and address human rights issues and impacts. Cargill, like other members in the Human Rights Working Group, also bring to bear our experience rolling out initiatives independently or in collaboration with other members, such as our pilot of Ulula, the worker voice tool. It's this diverse experience and expertise around the table that means a really well-balanced group and meaningful collaboration towards solutions. Over the past year, the working group has accomplished a notable feat. We've worked remotely together to develop the RSPO Human Rights Working Group 2023 strategy, which is in fact going to be finalized this week, so you can anticipate to be hearing more about this. Work in the group is over the next 3 years is really going to focus on ensuring women's economic empowerment principles are applied and promoted, alongside improving due diligence, monitoring, and sharing best practices on how to resolve human rights issues, to name a few. So tonight, our panel of experts will share with you insights on human rights trends, opportunities, challenges, as well as progressive initiatives being undertaken by their organizations to tackle human rights issues. So first, we're going to begin with Arti, who will share more insights related to the report commissioned by Cargill, Bunge, Lotus, Crocklin, and Mondelez. Arti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. One of the main reasons you've invited me is because of the report, as you mentioned, that was published by Embode, looking at the situation of migrant workers in Malaysia, with part of the focus on the palm oil sector. And this was quite an interesting and broad study that we conducted. And it did take a couple of years to do it, just because of the access. As you mentioned, it was commissioned by industry, Cargill, Mondelez International, and Bungi Loader's Croplan. And the main impetus for the study was a concern from industry about the situation, but also a kind of need to investigate and inquire into how should industry take up their role and how should industry work with the other stakeholders, government, not just the Malaysian government, but also the sending country governments, the governments of countries where migrant workers are coming from. And there was a real impetus to find solutions about how everybody should work together, rather than just regurgitate the facts, which we all know. And we undertook this in two phases. The phase one was in Malaysia, and we consulted widely across government, non-government, industry, migrant workers, and migrant networks. And the second phase was actually undertaken in Nepal, where we interviewed again the same cross-section of civil society, government, agents at different levels of the recruitment of, in the labor recruitment supply chain, let's say, from local level, especially where migrant workers are being recruited to go to Malaysia, to the national level. And our findings are laid out, and they're all available on our website, set out the context, not only the regulatory context, but we also did an analysis of how sending country governments and Malaysia's regulations regarding migrant workers matched up or didn't in some ways. And we found some gaps. And at the same time, we looked at the labor supply chain, we looked at the recruitment process of migrant workers, and we did an analysis of how agents work together, how recruitment agents work together, both licensed and unlicensed, formal and informal, local and national, and regional. And we found some really interesting dynamics, economic dynamics, business model dynamics about how workers are recruited. And that's one of the reasons we found that some of the contemporary or current responses to concerns around ethical recruitment or fair recruitment aren't really fitting with the reality of the situation. And interestingly, we also did an analysis of the dynamics, and we made some recommendations to all stakeholders, not just industry, but to governments, both migrant workers sending governments and the Malaysian government. One of our main recommendations was really to make sure we better consult workers. It was one of the elephants in the room, really. We're all talking about migrant workers, but how often do we actually talk to migrant workers themselves? How often are they consulted? Even in public media, we often see articles written about migrant workers' situations, but we hardly ever see, in the Malaysian context, let's say, but we hardly ever see real consultation of workers. And that's one of our key recommendations. And we also did identify some other elephants in the room, but I will leave that for discussion later. I think my 5 minutes is up, isn't it, Alex?
Thanks, Arti, indeed. Serena, you're up next. Serena, you're on mute.
Okay, so thank you, Rspo, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And this is a very important issue that the palm sector has been facing. IOI in particular realized this in 2016, 2017. We decided to work together very closely with Finwatch and as well as with RAND to come up with our recruitment process guidelines with respect to recruiting our workers. And we came out with a labor process, which is the three-part phase. The first phase is pre-employment, in which we looked into the part of recruitment of our workers in different countries like Indonesia, in India, in Bangladesh, and we set out a set of rules to, for example, have a specific checklist for the kind of recruitment agents that we were going to select. We set out a policy of no recruitment fee, where IOI, for example, pays for all the fees related to the visas, the levies, the medical, security clearance, and even the transportation from the sending country to Malaysia. We also work towards looking into ensuring that the workers are aware of what kind of job they are doing. We have set up videos for them to be shown at the sending country so that they are aware in their own country what kind of jobs are expected, that they are coming to a oil palm plantation and not somewhere in a hotel or in some nice urban cities. We also set out to make sure that their contracts are being translated in their language, to make sure that they know exactly that they are, what are the terms and conditions. And this is all videotaped in a YouTube, and you can actually access the YouTube. We also have made sure that at the sending country itself, that we ask them, did you pay for any recruitment fee? So we've set all this part on the pre-employment side. So once they come over to Malaysia, the second phase, which we call the employment phase, is where we sit down and we have a pre-interview at the start when they first arrive, to see and ask them a specific questions of what is it that they have done, what is it that they have understood, do they know that they are not supposed to pay a recruitment fee? And again, this was repeated when they went to the respective estates and they undergo induction training. So towards the last phase, which is the third phase, which is the end of employment, this is where we have an exit interview to ask them whether there's anything that needs to be addressed in terms of their staying in Malaysia and working in Malaysia before they left for the country. So all this is done under external monitoring as well. We have, of course, Rspo audits, but we also have employed BSR, for example, and most recently last year, we have 2019, ProForest has looked into all our steps to verify that these are being implemented. I think that part of the recruitment process was extremely important, and this was all done by 2018. We have implemented the no recruitment fee and the guidelines, and this was done together with BSR. So I think the next thing that I would like to discuss about is how do we address our workers during this COVID-19? And this is really, really important as well, because
and Serena, I think that's a great point that we'll come back to in the discussion. So for the just being conscious of the time, I'd like to move on to Matt, but I will come back to COVID-19 and the impacts on workers. Now, Matt, you're working with companies across textiles, hospitality, and food and ingredients, including the likes of H&M, Mandarin Oriental, and The Body Shop. It would be great to hear your thoughts and in terms of what your organization is doing and some of the trends you're seeing.
So my name is Matt Friedman, CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. I think to start any discussion like this, we have to focus on the problem. It's estimated there's 40 million people in modern slavery. 25 million of them are in forced labor. 16 million of them are associated with the private sector or supply chains. That means 25,200 people are entering this situation per day, or one every 4 seconds. We, for the last 30 years, have had NGOs, governments, and the United Nations kind of focusing on the issue. But if you look at the statistics, last year, 100,000 people were helped out of modern slavery, which is about 0.2% of the victims, not even 0.5%. Part of the reason for this is the profits generated from modern slavery are $150 billion a year. The amount of money that's used to fight it is about 350 million, or 0.23% of the profits. About 15,000 people like me, do-gooder types that focus on this against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals, and awareness of this issue is abysmally low. So the private sector hasn't really been involved in this until around 2012, where we saw a number of kind of changes taking place. The first was transparency legislation. This was legislation that basically said, if you're a big company and you have products in North America or the UK or Australia or France or other locations, you got to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. There were lawsuits against major companies. We see this in the fishing industry, the chocolate industry, palm oil as well. You see that type of thing. Significant media coverage increasing for the last year. It's doubled every single year. And ESG, the environmental social governance indicator, people are asking questions. How do we know that the products that we're using aren't tainted by modern slavery? So the Mekong Club was set up to basically act as a catalyst for change, working with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them identify what the issue was and what to do to address it. So we have an association model. We have about 50 members. The members are divided into 4 groups: banks, manufacturers, retailers, hospitality. We also deal with construction and tech activities. And on a quarterly basis, our association members come together, debate, discuss, and then identify what needs to be done to protect them, to help them, to raise awareness. And so a lot of what we see is training programs that are geared towards helping all different levels of private sector organizations to figure out what they need to do. We develop tech tools that will allow for auditors to go into locations to collect information in multiple languages. We work with blockchain technology. We have developed all kinds of analysis and tools and publications. All of this geared very much to the private sector, so the private sector knows what the issue is, what they need to do in order to address it, in order to move forward. The last thing I'll say is that we try to emphasize a multi-stakeholder approach where we bring the community together as much as possible. This allows for sharing among the members. It allows for them to see kind of and be barometered by peer pressure activities and to basically mentor each other through this process. As a result of us doing this, a large number of people have been identified and helped out of modern slavery, and it's done in a very cost-effective, beneficial way, because you don't have to raise money in order to get them out. Basically, the private sector, once they learn how to address the issue and they have all the tools and means to do it, they do it themselves. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I'd like to, at a later point, dig into some of those best practices that have helped support that progress, albeit small. So Gerald, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to Rspo for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with other panelists speaking on human rights issues. The National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, in short, SUHAKAM, receives complaints of all natures, and one of it is on labor migration issues, either by the NGOs or some individuals. I agree with the speakers about the employment process is totally rotten because we don't have a transparent system or seamless end-to-end system, and also corrupt system does not help make it transparent. So I think that's all where we are at in terms of employment. And then at another layer, the subcontracting. So the supply chain issue comes. The big companies may be clean on the books, but then when you pay somebody else, you need to check at every detail, and that's the tough part. But my worry actually is the smaller players that actually are not, don't have the means to ensure that they don't take shortcuts and underpay workers. So we know the reason why this happens by the millions, as mentioned earlier. In this COVID period, it's also the easiest to cut them off when companies are suffering. They don't have the means, they shut down temporarily. The best thing is pretend that the workers have created some problem, let them loose, and they automatically become unregistered or illegal, as it's called here. You know? So they don't have a fallback system, and many of them do not find it empowered enough to come and make a complaint formally because they are very vulnerable. And we have worked with other human rights commissions in home country, like in Nepal Human Rights Commission, hoping when they actually get back to continue their story, but they don't because they continue with life and seek for money. So we know vulnerability is a big issue. And I think the other point about a specialized issue in Malaysia is about the nature of stateless or undocumented people, mainly in some parts of Malaysia, like in Sabah. that becomes very difficult. And I think the recent forced labor allegations in the US, originating in the US, is pointing to that. And we understand that this is difficult because statelessness and undocumented is not the power of companies to render them these documents. It's the government's duty to resolve. And this state, one part of Malaysia, Sabah, have had this for generations. But these people have families, they have a right to live, they have a right to work, and companies need the employment. They want to legalize them, but without a government policy in enabling such legalization, what do? Do you kick them all out? Do you forget them? And you need them and they need you. So I think it's a strange way to blame forced labor, when actually this forced labor is caused by historical reason, and it's a state responsibility to find a solution for this. But my point is, even if you employ stateless or undocumented person, it's the company's prerogative not to discriminate, because you cannot say because they're undocumented, I'll pay them less, or they don't have weekly leave or annual leave or no medical. So that's my test on companies if they have no choice in Sabah to employ people. But this is a long-standing issue, and that's when I think government's policy framework needs to come in to work with plantation sector, manufacturing sector in order to find some solutions. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop at that point now. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. So Arti, I have a question for you. As many in the audience are aware, AP released a series of deeply concerning reports surfacing allegations of forced child labor as well as sexual assault and harassment in plantations. This type of transparency is important for raising awareness of the public. I think we all agree on that. However, companies are finding it difficult to act on this information through their grievance procedures, which have been established in the first place to react and address these issues accordingly. You know, these procedures are really meant to complement more proactive work on progressively improving labor practices in the industry. How do you reconcile the many examples of positive initiatives by the palm industry to improve labor standards with increased reporting and international action against the palm sector for concerns regarding forced labor?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said at the beginning, Alex, was that this issue is notoriously difficult to audit. And as Gerald mentioned, you know, a lot of these migrant workers are extremely vulnerable and they find it very difficult to speak up. And so in my view and in the work that we've done, we're finding that a lot of the grievance mechanisms, even when they're set up, they're not working. And the reason they're not working is because workers don't feel comfortable to speak up. Worker voice initiatives need to be supported by a culture in companies, in plantations, a culture where workers are able to directly communicate with their employers. In many corporate systems, most of the workers don't feel they're able to directly communicate, number one. Normally, they often communicate through agents. Not in all cases, there's always other companies that don't use agents, such as Dr. Serena has been talking about. And also, workers don't feel comfortable about talking about what they think that they've signed a paper saying, you know, often before they leave their countries of origin, they've signed papers saying they haven't paid recruitment fees. They've signed papers saying they haven't taken a loan, or they're under a lot of debt before they come. They're under huge amounts of pressure. They're also coming from rural parts of their countries. They arrive in Malaysia and it's a new country, it's a new culture, it's a new corporate, and they're extremely vulnerable. So communication and cultural change within plantations is one of the first steps. And this is one of the things that we're not looking at because we're focusing too much on compliance. We're focusing too much on checkbox exercises. But actually, we need some attitudinal, behavioral, and cultural changes in a lot of these companies. So that's one of, I think, the reasons why we've got this disconnect between cases coming up, international reporting by NGOs and the media, and then obviously corporates scratching their head saying, but we're doing everything you're telling us to do, and this is not working. I think that this is one of the areas of disconnect. I could talk more about this, but this is largely how I would describe the problem.
Serena, would you like to respond to that? You're on mute.
So actually, I'm just going to follow up on what Arti is saying about workers. I mean, we have workers coming from Indonesia, and I guess with Indonesian workers, because they are more exposed to what's expected in the palm plantation, it's not so much of an issue as when we have migrant workers coming from, say, India or Bangladesh, or even Nepal, because they are not exposed to the palm culture. And I have to agree that to the point in which we have tried very much to ensure that workers, for example, from India, are being exposed to the kind of work that they are going to be given. Even despite that, you're right. It is very difficult for us, to get them to understand. Even when we use people from their own country to translate at the time of the initial interview when they arrive in Malaysia, and even at the estates when we have what we call the Employee Consultative Council, and each Employee Consultative Council is a representative from their own country to help them to assimilate into the estate. But it's still always an issue. Obviously, they are not exposed to the kind of environment with a different kind of culture, with the kind of language. And this is why, for example, we try to make sure that our workers have their own representation within what we call the Employee Consultative Council, for that they could voice their discomfort or whatever issues. We also have direct, WhatsApp as well, a hotline. But you're right, this is not something that they are, exposed to, and they're not familiar with that kind of reporting. So it's a matter of making sure for us now, especially when we get workers from India or from Bangladesh, to actually now to make sure that they come from villages that are already aware of what their own, workers are doing in Malaysia, so that they are comfortable and know and understand what they are facing coming to work in Malaysia.
Serena, thanks. So it's a huge task at hand, and certainly there's room for improvement and reflection here. There's also a role for governments to play. So Gerald, it'd be good to hear from you. Are there any legislative initiatives taking place in Malaysia that we should be aware of in terms of addressing these issues?
Well, Malaysia is stuck in between an elected government and then an unelected government. So it's a very fluid situation. I think that speaks to the lack of political will for the reforms that we thought were moving on. I think just a year ago, 9 laws for labor laws were actually under the microscope, and we were part of it. The commission was part of it to give input for, I would say, quite a progressive rethinking after decades, but it's gone silent now, and that's where I think an opportunity is lost. Number two, just a year and a half ago, an independent committee on migrant labor was considered. I was a member of that committee. Report completed. Our reading was mainly, it's time for a transparent, end-to-end, seamless labor migration policy. So that less hands are involved in between, so less it's cleaner, and workers have a say as well as it benefits employers. But that report never saw the light of the day. It's stuck somewhere in the cabinet and it's not made public. So I think it's a waste when 11 independent individuals were called to make a report. So that's the other proposal of reforming the whole migration policy, which is stuck, I think, in 3-4 decades ago, and the power relations are so far. Which brings me to my final point about the vulnerability of workers is not only left to people like you and me, either as supporters of rights of human beings or employers or the government of the country they're in. There's also a role and responsibility of the sending government, and this is where the Commission has met many embassies to ask them to be proactively involved. And I think this COVID sort of proves that point even sharper and painfully, because many workers are still stuck in detention centers, although they have cleared their jail time for not having a legal document. They have completed, they should have been sent home. So they are detained not because they have not complied with any law, but because they are stuck in the tangle of the legal, economic, diplomatic. Diplomatic meaning that the government is not able to get a flight, the receiving government has a policy that the flights cannot arrive. The ticket prices have gone up from 500. So many of the employers say, we prepared for 500 ringgit ticket, now it's 1,300. And so all this delaying technique, but all this means that worker is still stuck in a detention center when he or she legally should not be. But because the law is such, they cannot be released out on the open, they need to be deported back to home. So I think the crucial role of the sending government is crucially important. And I think money cannot be a reason not to participate actively. And I think this has been proven even more because usually it's about the bad policies in country, which is agreed. I think all our colleagues here have mentioned it absolutely clearly. And also the cleaning up of the system. And this is where two countries, sending, receiving countries, also have very corrupt practices. So middlemen, middlewomen agencies can put in their hand and try some tricks. And despite all documents signed by workers professing that they have not paid because they just need that job, So the vulnerability and desperate economic need pushes them here. But how come there is no system that enables them to move from border to border, and that respect is given to them? So I think that's where the reform of laws are there on paper, but I think it's a long way coming. I think it's internal negotiation between companies, between human rights entities, and workers' empowerment. And sadly, the unions here, many of the foreign workers are not unionized, and that makes them even more vulnerable to try to defend their rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Matt, would you like to weigh in?
Basically, the issue that we face that's most relevant to the palm oil industry is the recruitment process from destination countries. One of the things that we worked on, because our community asked us to do this, was to use blockchain technology to develop an app that would allow for kind of the recruitment agent and the recruitee to blockchain the information, everything that they've gone through, the fees, the pay, everything else, so that when they get to the source country, they are able to, from their phone, access this information. It's not lost, it's not changed, it's immutable. That particular approach offers the possibility of basically allowing the employee to be transparent about what it is that happened, and not to have to kind of say, well, I signed something and now I'm signing something else, because they have access to it. What we anticipate happening over time is that not only will this type of agreement be blockchained, but also within manufacturing sites, agriculture sites, fishing sites, all information related to the employees, the amount of money they get paid, the number of hours they work, and so forth, will be put into a blockchain format. Now, for those of you who don't understand what blockchain is, basically what it does is it takes information and it puts it into a scenario where it can't be changed or altered. And when new information is added, it's added to it, and it creates these things that are called blocks. These blocks allow for transparency, and they offer an opportunity for people basically to be in a scenario whereby whatever information, whatever agreement, whatever thing that they signed is available to who needs it. Let's say a brand is doing an audit or a factory is doing an audit, that information would be available. And so we see this as kind of a trend that hopefully in the future will add value to the transparency issue we see across many countries.
So I'd like to shift over to some of the questions from the audience. We have one from Daryl Delgado. So basis the fact that migrant workers are barred from exercising their freedom of association being a major factor, and excuse me, I'm not reading this properly. The fact that migrant and especially irregularly recruited and undocumented workers are systematically barred from exercising their freedom of association is a major factor. While migrants are legally allowed to join unions, they cannot become officers, and existing unions led by locals do not prioritize migrant issues. What are companies doing to address this issue at the recruitment and hiring phase? Serena, could you answer that?
So most of our workers that are undocumented are mostly in Sabah. And in Sabah, the issue of recruitment is not what is occurring in Peninsular Malaysia. So when you talk about freedom of association and union, our workers are all union. They are allowed to join the union, and we are part of the union. So the issue of that doesn't occur in IOI. Now, just going back into the issue of whether or not they are allowed to be, hold an office in the unions, that's not within our control, because that's under the union, whatever the local unions are undertaking, that's what they have to address. But in terms of the undocumented workers, we treat them the same as our documented workers, simply because for us, those documented workers, undocumented workers will need to be legalized, and we have to show process of them getting legalized, especially in Sabah, because whenever we are all Rspo certified, and under Rspo audit, this is part of what they look at. And we don't only look into the workers, but we also look into the dependents, because the dependents, even though they are not documented, we try to help our workers to get them documented. For us, a stabilized worker is a worker that will not abscond. So it is of utmost importance for us to get them documented. And the process are all very transparent, because we need to show that we are working towards to get legalized. And this is, and we have been working very closely with the Sabah government to see that they come up with this amnesty program from time to time, so that we can at least try to get our workers, legalized. I hope I've answered part of your questions.
Thanks. RC, do you have anything to add? Just coming back to your report, some of the good practices that you're seeing in terms of consulting with workers, addressing these issues in plantations, and also, I guess, what companies can do where there is they are working within frameworks which are not necessarily as legal frameworks, which are not necessarily as strong.
Just a couple of things also before I directly answer that question. First of all, one of the reasons that, the disconnect that we were talking about earlier between the international reports and what companies are doing, why is there such a big gap? It feels like, migrant workers in palm oil plantations are a lot of them are in remote locations, whereas other foreign workers in Malaysia may be in urban areas working in factories. The particular distinction of plantation workers are that they are removed, and they do feel isolated, especially when they don't have access to, let's say, internet. So that's one thing. And so where do they get access to services? Where do they get access to information about what their rights are, policy changes at the Malaysian level or from their own country level? We know that a lot of the embassies of their countries are setting up Facebook groups and doing lots of kind of announcements. But migrant worker networks, where migrant workers help migrant workers, are unfunded. They cannot be set up in Malaysia. So it's not just that foreign workers can't hold office in trade unions, and therefore their views aren't represented in trade unions, but also they can't associate themselves, and it's all based on volunteer networks. A lot of the efforts that companies are taking is to try and have consultation groups, but that's not working, because at the end of the day, one of the other elephants in the room is what is what is the way in which foreign workers are considered in not only the Malaysian context, but also in the context of a lot of companies? They're treated as foreign workers, only as foreign workers, not always as human beings that have right to family life. They can get married, they can have children. You cannot bring your family to Malaysia. If you leave that job, you cannot go and work somewhere else. You have to leave the country. So they're only treated in one dimension. And if you imagine your own life to be treated only in one dimension, from your company, from your country, the country that you're living in, it's a very limited situation. So again, coming back to the work that companies are doing, yes, consultation is great, independent consultation. Help your workers have access to independent services, including embassy phone lines, helplines, as well as their trade unions back home. A lot of these workers are members of trade unions back in Indonesia, in Nepal, in India. They have connections in Malaysia to migrant worker networks, embassy consulates. You know, the Indonesian embassy has consulates all over Malaysia, and they have labor attaches, as does the Nepal government, the Filipino government. So these are the kinds of services that workers need to have access to outside of the companies that they're working for. So that's one of the major recommendations I would make, and I think companies can start doing that too. Yeah.
Matt, would you like to respond to that?
This is a question that I don't think I have enough information to respond to. I'll pass on this one.
Okay. So a question to Gerald that's coming up. Thank you for pointing out that it is not about hiring the undocumented workers in Sabah Sarawak. It is about if these workers are treated equally. What is your view regarding compliance to the law and regulations for hiring undocumented workers?
Thanks for the question. So the 2 points. The first is it's a policy decision to address this decades-old problem of undocumented people living in Sabah because of the porous borders historically. So without addressing that, the people live there. It's a lie to say that they don't exist. They have existed. The numbers could be in the million. They have families, they have children, and they need to live. So I think at one point, if the government recognizes that's a problem, it needs time to resolve it, then create an environment where registration enables them to work on the books legally. The previous government that just lost the last state election, they were moving towards that, but it's a political minefield. So anyone who tries to address that gets attacked and say you are trying to give people free citizenship. You know, this is this anti-foreigner logic that don't give people citizenship. And it's not about citizenship, it's about legalizing them and putting them legally on a book so you know who exists. And we've always told the government, you need to know who's in our country. People without documents is not good for economics, for security, for social issues. So get them on the book. You don't have to give them a passport or an IC, but they need to have some documents. So that's the one part. In the meanwhile, I think any company needs to, I think it's about time Malaysia enables company legally that it's okay to hire them. And so then you can check and test the companies that there's no discrimination between undocumented foreign worker or local worker, because I think that standard should be cut across. So my point is a long-term issue because law and policy, but regulation can be done. And I think now the system, I'm saying it as I see it and I hear it, is like one eye open, one eye closed, you know. Everybody knows they exist and everybody knows that the companies need to employ people to cut the right palm oil and there's not enough workers. So everybody sort of knows this and they smile about it, but what is done? So this increases the vulnerability and does not help respond to other linked up issues. The issue of the women there, the issue of health, the issue of the children's education. That's why I think the working together with embassies for kind of a legal solution. And I think the Indonesian government has set up a few schools. Some NGOs have set up a few schools, which I think is a good way forward, but not enough. It's just a drop in the ocean. If Alex, I mean, just move on to add something else on the broader part about
a quick one, Gerald, because we're getting towards the end of the session, but please do go ahead.
Yeah. So actually the few questions asking about the issue of audits. I think Rspo is an expert on that, but I'm going to speak as the National Human Rights Commission. I think it's time, because our investigation powers on human rights violation means we need to go in also to your companies to check on this allegation. It works well both ways, because you clear the doubt, but you also can prove the integrity that you have nothing to hide. So unannounced visit is part of our work to move in for prison, police lockups, but I think it's about time. We're talking now with some of the big plantations. After informing them, then we will present ourselves for unannounced visit. And this is, I think someone mentioned that it's not hired by the company. This is on our own account based on information or allegations of human rights violation. Thank you.
On that note, there's a question for Arti. Having looked into labor conditions in the Malaysian palm oil industry, do you note a difference between RSPO certified, MSPO certified, or non-certified plantations?
I would need to conduct more research before I could fully answer that. But one of the findings that we did have from our research is that where there is some level of certification, whether it's MSPO or RSPO, there is a greater level of awareness amongst all the different departments of the company or the plantations we're talking about, because they will have to have gone through an internal operational process to get their policies and their conduct in order. So that's one thing. In terms of what I was talking about earlier, compliance versus, changing the dynamics beneath the surface. This is something that is, something else. But generally, I'd say that certification is not the panacea, as we know, but it's always the first step, the second step. And happy to see that, I don't know what the current status is, that the Malaysian government wanted all palm oil plantations to be MSPO certified. That's just the first step, because that puts things in order. Meetings need to be had, this thing needs to be ordered, this policy needs to be had. Then once you've got the system in place, then you work at the next level about how do you actually have a relationship with your migrant workers. It's about having a relationship and actually treating each other in a manner that you listen to each other, mutually respectful. And then you have one of the other things was, companies are doing a lot of training on labor rights awareness amongst their own management staff. And that's one of the good things that we're seeing. Training needs to be also followed up with, attitudinal cultural change in companies. And that's something that's not being talked about enough, because the Malaysian context is such that people have views about foreign workers that infiltrate companies.
So as we come to a close in our session, I'd like to end on a positive note, a hopeful note, and have closing views from the panelists on where your hope, your vision is for the private sector, where you're seeing initiatives that can be scaled. And particularly, Matt, I'd like to start with you, building on a point Gerald made in terms of smaller organizations are lacking capacity. You are working with a number of organizations of different sizes, and so it would be great to start with you in terms of your hope and where you see the potential for working with smaller organizations to improve these practices.
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm super optimistic that enough things are happening simultaneously, both carrots and sticks, that will result in kind of a lot more attention to this particular issue. While we tend to work with large companies, we also find that the smaller companies that want to become larger companies follow what the larger companies are doing. So those organizations that have more resources in order to focus on compliance and risk assessment and audits and so forth tend to be the ones that are identified as doing more. But my personal experience working with the private sector is that we don't go after companies, we go after individuals within companies who, for whatever reason, care about this particular topic. And so what we try to do is to mine them, and whether they're in a big country, a small kind of big company, small company, medium size, there are always people who, for whatever reason, really do care about this issue. So we'll do a mass webinar. We will attract attention from all different size companies. And then depending upon the size, we will give them the tools and the means and the insight and the awareness raising and the risk assessment ability to be able to address even within their organization, no matter what size, what it is they need to do to be on the right side of addressing issues of forced labor. And a lot of the things that we kind of help them with is just raising awareness so that they know what the issue is, and then offering a whole range of different tools that they can use depending upon where they are in their journey in the process to achieve this endpoint.
Thanks, Matt, for those thoughts. Serena, over to you. It'd be great for you to share kind of your hopes for your organization and initiatives that you really think are going to drive that change. You have 1 minute.
Yeah, that's a very short minute. So anyway, I would like to say that, you know, for us, our workers are actually our, our means to achieve our business. And for us, we think that taking care of them and making sure that they are stable are actually very important for us. So that's one of the reasons why I participate in this sort of series, in sort of panel discussions, to get insights from external stakeholders, so that we can make sure that if there's anything that we can implement within our company to ensure the stable workforce, this is something that we want to look for. So that's about it for the time being.
Thanks, Serena. Over to you, Gerald.
Yes, thank you. I think workers are human beings, so human rights of every worker doesn't fade with any type of status or nationality. So I think that's something to bring forth. And I believe that while we call on, we shout on, we pray, we hope for governments to move faster, reality is a lot of private sector companies have a lot of influence and power. And I think that investment, as I think Dr. Serena also mentioned, in the workers, and the framing of the workers start from their home to present for protection and empowerment. I think without the empowerment part, you lose because they're too vulnerable, somebody will exploit them. And let's hope for greater transparency. I'm inspired that from the worker side, if blockchain works, that's great. From the government side, if Malaysia has a Freedom of Information Act, that's long due, like India, there is such an act. And even companies, I think more proactive sharing of your process information will be a great step in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Arti, over to you for your last remark.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to list the good practices that I've been seeing so far. It's fantastic when companies work with government and try to lift labor standards and other human rights standards within the Malaysian context. We see companies also working with grassroots civil society organizations to help consult their workers. This is also brilliant. Any collaborations with civil society, NGOs, migrant worker networks in particular, working with the workers at recruitment level from the origin countries. We've spoken to workers, they really like that. They really like it when they can speak to their future employers' representatives in the country before they leave. Workers also like direct relationships with their managers. They don't want to have to go through agents. They like to have a direct communication with their managers. They like to be heard. So when they say, look, we don't feel safe in our accommodation and a change happens, they feel like they can trust their employers. Training and awareness for management staff, allowing access to your plantations and your factories from NGOs or other research agencies like us. We were allowed access. These are really good practices. And of course, ongoing research and assessments that, like the one that was commissioned for us, but ongoing work where you collaborate with experts and commission research, because you need to keep on knowing. This is a road of learning and we can't know it all in one go. So these are good stuff. This is good stuff we've been seeing.
Arti, thanks so much. Some great points today in terms of best practice, improving transparency and raising the voice of workers. I'm looking forward to a continued dialogue with you all through the Human Rights Working Group. And Dan, and thank you to the audience this evening today for your attention. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all. Wow, that was really an amazing panel. exactly the type of content that we're going to be looking to bring to this series, where we can really, I wish we had 2 hours for it, but unfortunately we only had an hour. You know, some high level takeaways from my standpoint while we organize our next panel. The consultation with workers is key and has to be key, and we need to continue to improve that. We're going to need unique programs to tackle these issues, and government to government dialogue is needed. We have to get better in that, and I think hopefully the RSPO can play a role in trying to help convene that government to government dialogue. There was a stat thrown out, I think by Matt, 100,000 or 0.02% of people were helped out of modern slavery. And the private sector just got engaged on this issue in 2012, thanks to transparency efforts. So I think, again, dialogues like this are going to be extremely important in terms of increasing that level of transparency, not just about what's working and patting ourselves on the back, but also talking about what's not working and how do we tackle these issues. There has to be a fallback system for workers when they don't work. That's an important point. So if they lose their job, they're vulnerable, and we have to make sure that there's a system in place for them. The issue of stateless individuals and the historical background on it, I think that's a very important context that we need to explore, and that could probably be a 2-hour session, if not longer, just on that issue. Love the blockchain work that the Mekong Club is doing. And I would love to see us explore that more from an RSPO perspective, and that's just my personal opinion. And I think, you know, it's an important point that the government right now has a chance to address these gaps in the system legislatively, and hopefully we, you know, again, my opinion, we can be a part of that solution if possible. And then I guess overall, one of the biggest takeaways I have is that the worker share of voice has to be improved. We need to look for technology. We need to look for systems that can help with getting that worker share of voice. Wow, that was a great panel. So